Hello friends, I'm Vitaly Portnikov. US Vice President J.D. Vance has acknowledged something that it seems to me has been obvious for quite some time, but had not been confirmed at the official level. There are simply no substantive negotiations currently taking place regarding the ultimate end of the ongoing Russian-Ukrainian war. Russia consistently refuses to participate in any trilateral consultations, in consultations with the Americans, and of course, in direct bilateral negotiations with Ukraine. It became clear that there would be no real negotiations to end the Russian-Ukrainian war in the near future after the failed summit between the presidents of the United States and the Russian Federation in Alaska. At that time, Donald Trump himself stated quite clearly to journalists that there would be no deal for now. And all subsequent efforts by the US president were primarily aimed at masking this defeat. At first, Trump spoke about the possibility of a trilateral summit between the presidents of the US, Russia, and Ukraine. Later, when Volodymyr Zelensky and the European leaders had already arrived in Washington, indeed, after a phone conversation, Putin commenced to strongly emphasize that a potential bilateral meeting could very well take place before the crucial trilateral one. Putin and Zelensky. But the Russian president himself, Vladimir Putin, spoke about this significant bilateral meeting more as a strategic way to simply buy some valuable time. After all, President Putin himself insisted that any potential negotiations with President Zelensky would absolutely require very thorough and careful preparation. And such thorough preparation during a time of active wartime conflict could potentially take 2 or even 3 full years, however long it genuinely takes for those diplomatic delegations to effectively work and reach an agreement. Thus, it became clear that there was actually no negotiation process at all. Currently, there are absolutely no contacts at the level of Russia, Ukraine, United States. Furthermore, there are no direct bilateral contacts whatsoever between the United States and Russia, and similarly, there are no bilateral contacts at all between Russia and Ukraine. Putin simply no longer wants to or is unable to drag things out by holding sham negotiations, so he just doesn't hold them anymore. The only thing of interest here is that the consultations between the Russians and the Americans are not only related to ending the Russian-Ukrainian war. Well, everything is clear here, diametrically opposed approaches. Putin hopes to destroy the Ukrainian state. Trump wants the war to end, at least along the line of contact between the troops. What is there even to negotiate about? But there are also no negotiations taking place regarding the restoration of the activities of diplomatic missions, those of the United States in Moscow and of the Russian Federation in Washington. It would seem that there are no problems here related to the war with Ukraine. But at the same time, there is absolutely no real trust between Russia and the United States. Moreover, the Russian side primarily interprets the very desire of the Americans themselves to hold negotiations as a clear sign of their perceived weakness. And in this situation, instead of negotiating with the new American administration, they are trying to put pressure on it. But this doesn't work simply because the American president does not give in to such blackmail. And thus, over these 8 significant months of Donald Trump's stay in the White House, it became abundantly clear that the President of the United States simply cannot reach any meaningful agreement whatsoever with the President of the Russian Federation. It's no coincidence that Trump says Putin has let him down and disappointed him. Although one could have been absolutely certain and entirely convinced that this particular outcome would inevitably happen and not some entirely different or unexpected turn of events, even long before Donald Trump officially appeared and took office in the prestigious Oval Office. Because the question is not at all about who is the President of the United States. The question is about who is the President of the Russian Federation. So, what exactly should be done to at least make Vladimir Putin consider at some point in the near future the absolute necessity of a realistic and meaningful negotiation process? J.D. Vance says that in the United States, they are currently considering the possibility of transferring long-range Tomahawk missiles to the nation of Ukraine. But of course, the final decision will rest with the President of the United States himself. Tomahawk missiles are a real way to force the President of the Russian Federation to take part in negotiations. Because then Putin will realize that these missiles threaten centers of power in the Russian Federation, military enterprises, military units, airfields, and strategic facilities in Russia. And now, the game certainly won't be one-sided anymore. Just as it tragically happened, for example, on Sunday, when the Russian Federation, seemingly in direct response to the latest provocative statements by US President Donald Trump, deliberately organized a new massive and devastating strike on Ukraine, including utterly deliberate and brutal attacks on residential neighborhoods in Kyiv and other major Ukrainian cities, unequivocally demonstrating that aerial terror against the innocent civilian population remains one of the primary and most significant foreign policy priorities of the Russian Federation in this ongoing, unjust, and truly devastating war. So, if Ukraine really does manage to obtain advanced long-range weaponry from both the United States and other supportive Western countries, and if it is indeed granted explicit permission to effectively utilize these powerful weapons to destroy critically important strategic targets of the Russian Federation, then Putin will inevitably come to fully understand that this protracted war truly needs to be ended, not at Ukraine's internationally recognized state border with Poland or Hungary, but precisely where Russian invading troops are currently positioned and located. Well, at the very least, in order not to lose the territories occupied by the Russians in the future. And then it will be possible to talk about the Russian Federation returning to the negotiating table with the Americans, or perhaps with the Ukrainians. Not because measures of trust will be restored. Of course, no one will ever trust anyone again. Because there will eventually be a need to ultimately end the conflict, the war. Because Russia will understand that Ukraine has enough weapons to repel Russian attacks and to create serious problems for the armed forces of the Russian Federation, as well as for the Russian political and military leadership. And if we limit ourselves only to empty rhetoric about how absolutely no negotiations are taking place and that Russia should seriously consider the urgent need to end this protracted war, then this rhetoric will remain just that, mere rhetoric, and nothing more than that. Because the Russian president does not pay attention to any word. And he is already convinced that the current American administration, in its relations with him, limits itself to words rather than concrete, tough action. And words suit the president of the Russian Federation perfectly as he prepares to expand the war, possibly even onto the territories of the United States allies in the North Atlantic Alliance. At the very least, the significant events of recent days and weeks, specifically the Russian drone attacks on Poland, the appearance of so-called unidentified drones in the airspace of Denmark, Norway, Sweden, and Germany, and the appearance of Russian fighter jets in Estonian airspace, all clearly indicate that the Russian Federation is not genuinely interested in meaningful negotiations with the United States. And this is a significant escalation of the current situation, the primary goal of which is to effectively force the administration of Donald Trump to agree to Vladimir Putin's specific terms for ultimately ending the ongoing Russian-Ukrainian war. And this is something that American politicians and officials who hope for a renewal of the US-Russian dialogue also need to understand. Thank you, friends. Stay on this channel, subscribe to it, follow me on my social media and on my Patreon, Buy Me a Coffee and Donatello channels, which help support the development of these resources. Use the sponsorship feature right here on YouTube. Victory and peace to you. Good luck.